What I want to cover today is the policy case study involving the future of West Coast salmon. And by West Coast, I mean California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, Yukon, Alaska. That would be the West Coast, really, of North America. And by salmon, I mean also including not only the Pacific salmon, Chinook, coho, and so on, but also steelhead and sea-run cutthroat trout. So basically we're talking about a broad definition of salmon along the northwestern coast of North America. Now this case study is interesting for a lot of reasons. One, it's a well-studied case study. It's been high visibility for well over 100 years. But also the principles involved in the case study apply to many other natural resource issues. Let's think about the facts of this case just a little bit. It's a relatively straightforward case study in the sense that salmon runs are declining and have been for well over a century. So it seems fairly straightforward. If society really wants to do something about these fish, it should seem relatively straightforward what to do. But let's look at that a little more carefully. When you look at the facts of the case, if recovering wild salmon is so straightforward, why has it not happened? I mean, after all, it's no surprise the causes of the decline of salmon, and so if you really wanted to change that, you could just change the causes and things would get better. But looking a little more carefully at the facts, let's review some of those facts. First is, the status of wild salmon is in long-term decline. And by long-term decline, I mean well over a century and a half, really starting in about 1848 with the discovery of gold. For the last almost 30 years, there's been Endangered Species Act listing, and the full force of the Endangered Species Act is conceivably involved, or could well be involved, in this issue, this case study. We also have large hatchery supplementation programs where the runs of salmon are supplemented by salmon growing in fish hatcheries. And in general, most of the runs these days, especially in the lower 48, are supported by hatchery runs rather than wild produced fish. So even though there's, relatively speaking, a fair number of salmon out there, most of those salmon in the lower 48 are in fact started their life in a hatchery. Also, the annual returns of salmon are highly variable. Even in areas where there's almost no fishing pressure, no alteration of the landscape, runs vary annually tremendously. So this is an issue where each year, with no other effects, there would be high variability of the run size. Now, the converse is that retail salmon, if you go to Costco, Safeway, other shopping grocery stores, you'll find salmon year-round. Quality is very high. They're relatively plentiful, and as things go, fairly modestly priced. They're basically always available, and the quality is very good. But almost all those are raised on what we call farms or net pens or sea pens. This is much like agriculture. You put them in as very young fish, grow them out using artificial feeds, and when they get to be an appropriate size, they're harvested. So it's pretty much a farming operation. So almost all the fish that you buy in a retail store are going to be farmed raised, which is really along the ocean, coast to shore almost always. And the quality is very high for these fish. Blind taste tests show that they're actually probably preferred to wild fish. Opinion polls. If you ask people, they universally support salmon recovery. This is not a case study like wolves, where there were actually lots of folks wanting to get rid of wolves. They don't do anything good. They basically kill our livestock, our working dogs, and so forth. And so let's get rid of them. There's no one really against salmon recovery. Now, when you trade it against some of the things that would have to be done to bring back salmon, people get less enthusiastic. But in general, there's no anti-salmon people. There's also confusion, I think, in the political process. That's probably the best way to describe it. There's really no consensus on what recovery policy ought to be. At one extreme would people say, do whatever it takes to bring back wild salmon to these previous numbers, the pre-1900, 1850 numbers. Another group would say, hey, salmon's just one more of many, many competing priorities, and we're never going to have 1850 conditions again, so we probably ought to be happy with the sea-run, the hatchery operations, and what they can produce. So there's a range of confusion there, and some people are on extreme poles. Most people are in the confused middle. Recovery efforts are costly. We spend an awful lot of money well over $1 billion a year in the lower 48 to recover wild salmon, probably several billions of dollars. Much of that cost is due to foregone opportunities, things that you would do except in the with the absence of this salmon recovery issue. But conversely, there's no long-term improvement. So even though this money is spent, maybe it's doing some good, but the bottom line is the salmon runs over the long term are broadly downward. The science is extensive about this case study. These fish, these Pacific salmon, have been well studied for many, many years. We know an awful lot about them. We certainly don't know everything. There's some big unknowns, but compared to any other group of fish, these are the best studied group of fish in the world. So if we don't have sufficient science to make policy choices now with these fish, we're never going to have it. And the science is also, even though there's a lot of it, it's suspect because there's a lot of money in salmon recovery being spent, and so scientists are hired and others are hired. And in many cases, these, quote, so-called scientists are fundamentally advocates for particular policy preferences. So people tend to be skeptical of the science that's produced in this policy debate because most of it is brought forth by people who are working for an organization that has a strong policy preference. And in general, I guess I would say about this case study is people overall are unhappy. A lot of money is being spent, little obvious improvement. So some people would argue we ought to spend a lot more, we ought to make a lot more tough choices to bring back salmon. And other people would say, hey, enough already, there's other priorities out there. Perhaps we ought to spend the money on K through 12 education or something else. Or maybe just let people keep their money rather than try to throw good money after bad. So these are kind of the facts of the case. There's not really a lot of debate about these facts. People all accept them, but they may come to very, very different policy preferences. Well, salmon runs, as I mentioned, over the long term, by long term I mean decades, have continued to decline. Certainly there's some times when they go up for short periods of time, maybe 10 years, and they gradually drop down. Why is that over the long term they're on this downward trajectory? Well, one of the things is we got to start by identifying society's policy choices. I mean, these things aren't magic. They happen because people make choices, and as a result, there's an effect. This is not really a science issue or a lack of science issue. We already know plenty about these fish, so there's nothing really secret here, and that's what I really want to talk about today. And we are going to do that by looking at policy analysis. That is, analyzing the choices that people have relative to salmon. And there's no policy preference that I'm trying to pitch here or trying to push. Basically, these are the facts of the case. People can look at the same set of facts and come up to very different policy choices. Let's start with the historical context. And this is important because this issue just didn't start last year or a few years ago. It's been going on for a long, long time. Well, let's look at the historical distribution of salmon. And if you want to really look at the historical distribution, you have to look going back thousands of years and go back to the Ice Age when salmon were pushed southward. Salmon have been in North America for a long, long time. But even 18,000 years ago, with the ice covering much of North America, they were pushed southward. And so the distribution of Pacific salmon were largely in what is now Lower California, Baja California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, a little bit into Wyoming, Nevada, but fundamentally they were in these areas. And of course they were not in areas like what is now British Columbia, Yukon, or in much of Alaska, because the ice covered the area. So about 18,000 years ago, the distribution was like the southern distribution is now. Now, if you go just 10,000 years ago, ice is receding, and so much of it has receded. And as with humans, salmon, as the land became ice-free, the salmon responded and colonized those areas. And if you look at the distribution 4,000 years ago, you get approximately today's distribution, roughly speaking. Climate was very different, quite a bit different, but still you got roughly the distribution you have now. If you start over there in North America, they've pretty much gone almost entirely, really entirely, from Lower California, Baja California, They're still in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, Yukon, up around Alaska, bend around going into the Arctic Ocean, and actually some salmon runs now are going into Canada through the Beaufort Sea up there in the Arctic Ocean. Jumping over to Asia, they're found down the coast of Russian Far East, the Korean Peninsula. There's residual runs there. There's residual runs in Japan. They're still there. And even China has some residual runs, but they're not not even close to what they were a hundred years ago. So it's a circum-Pacific, North Pacific distribution of salmon, roughly going all the way from California up around Alaska and Russian Far East and down to China, Taiwan, that area. If we come to the modern era, and the modern era from a salmon perspective is defined as the 1848 starting point with the discovery of gold in California. And that's really the time where salmon runs really started to take a hit. And so we're going to refer to this as the modern era, roughly the last 165 years or so. The causes of the decline over the last 165 years, and this again, the area is California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and southern British Columbia, have been many, but the major ones are these. First is the gold rush operation themselves. Gold was discovered in California, Central Valley. There were other discoveries very quickly in Idaho, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, up and down the coast, Alaska. And these gold rush operations were not good from a salmon perspective, especially in Central California. A large quantity of gravel was excavated and blasted off the surface, and these salmon runs here were decimated in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and they've never recovered since, and it's not likely they're going to recover anytime soon. So that was the beginning of the decline of salmon in the modern era. The second driver was intensive commercial fishermen. Initially, fishing was from miners and others, which would just basically catch every fish in a given stream for the protein value to sell the meat to the miners. And then commercial fishermen started in the Central Valley of California, and again over the years moving up to the north, and eventually reaching Alaska in the early 1900s. And these were very, very intense fishing efforts, and also the kind of gear they used, gill nets particularly, tended to take fish of a certain size, and so you get a great distortion of the distribution of size, and so it tends to select for certain desirable species as well. So that was a big effect. Then you also have a lot of lesser effects, but significant, especially in certain areas, and that's logging operations, particularly the sluicing of logs down rivers, which would scour out rivers. And even when you go to the coast now of Oregon, Washington, and places where there's been intensive logging, even though the logging is much less than it was historically, the sluicing effect, it's cleaned out stream beds and a lot of gravel has been removed and so forth. And those rivers, streams, were highly altered, and that's going to take a long time for them to come back, if they ever do. Then, of course, we have the issue of dams. Now, we all usually think about the large main stem dams, of which there's 11 on the Columbia, another 3 or 4 on the Snake, all these big dams. But in fact, there's many, many hundreds of more, thousands of more smaller dams. And these dams collectively are not a good thing from a salmon perspective. And the thing that people oftentimes tend to overlook is the fact that it's not just the adults coming up the river, but the young fish going down. So you change the hydrology, the hydrograph, water flows greatly, and this alters the life cycle of fish, of salmon. It causes a relatively higher mortality. So while none of these things are fatal, in aggregate, they're all downward pressures. And then, of course, we have other issues oftentimes associated with dams like irrigation. I mean, much of the West is dry, and so requires, if you're going to do any farming, requires irrigation, which takes water, which takes dams, and none of which is good from a salmon perspective. Some other fish species do extremely well in these environments, so it's not like all fish do poorly. It's just usually it's the native species, particularly the anadromous species, that don't do well. And then we have just land use alteration in general. I mean, you have a large number of people in the western United States now, the far western United States, and that just their footprint, if you will, causes big effects on salmon. Just routine road construction development has a big effect. And then, of course, you have competing species. As I mentioned, a lot of species are doing extremely well. Largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, bluegills, walleyes, pikes. A lot of these species, walleyes, are doing extremely well because the landscape, the habitat's been changed to favor them. So now that they've got good, well-established populations, they are major competitors for salmon that are trying to hang on. The salmon habitat pre-1848 was well appropriate for salmon, but the habitat now is much, much better for walleyes and shad and other introduced species. And then, of course, you have hatcheries. Now, hatcheries as a tool are not really good or bad. It depends what your goal is. If you want to maintain runs, any kind of fishable size, you're probably going to have to use hatcheries. But if you do supplement the runs through hatcheries, you maintain fishing pressure, and that fishing pressure will tend to take some wild salmon, which are very less abundant than hatchery derived fish. So that's not really good or bad, it's just a kind of a fact of life. Now, there are some things you can do to reduce the effect, but it's never, as long as you've got fishing pressure, you're going to get some mortality on wild fish. And if the runs are very low so far as wild fish goes, that's not a good thing. So these are basically the causes of the decline over the last 165 years or so. Now let's look more specifically about how those changes in wild salmon numbers play out. Now, salmon are resilient. These are not delicate, dainty, dainty species that require very, very precise habitats. I mean, they will, given half a chance, they will survive. But let's look at the long-term trends. Starting in 1848 on the left, going through today, here we have total run size, and this area is California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, does not include British Columbia or Alaska. So you start in 1848, and just arbitrarily, let's just give that number 100%. That number was probably, 50 million fish or so in those areas, but let's give it 100%. And the first thing you can see is the long-term trend is downward, and so there's ups and downs. Now, what causes those? That's kind of cyclic effect. This is a smooth curve, so the data aren't quite this good looking. So what causes those cyclic effects? Well, that's ocean conditions, weather conditions generally, but particularly ocean conditions. Ocean conditions over a decade or two can be favorable for salmon or unfavorable, and runs, all things being equal, tend to go up or down. So you get this long-term, broadly speaking, cyclical effect. But the fact is, at the end of the day, runs now are in the low single digits of their historical level. Now, this is wild fish. Salmon that are from hatcheries tend to be 4 times numbers, but you're still less than 10% no matter how you slice it. You have very small run size compared to historical. Now, one thing about it is you've got to be very careful is when you look at data like this is you don't overinterpret it. For example, let's imagine that you are a career fisheries person, and where would you like to have your career? I mean, on the left arrow there, you've got a situation where runs is declining rather precipitously, and if you extrapolate that out, within a few decades, they're going to be extinct. Or you've got another period of maybe 30 years where on the right arrow there, it goes up. And if you look at that, you could draw a lot of conclusions like, hey, things are getting better, maybe it's due to my management activities and so forth. So the first question you might say is, when would you like to have your career? Now, in my experience, most people in the field would immediately jump to the right arrow, that is the increase. But in reality, you're probably better off to have your career on the left arrow, the steep decline, because if you do, that's when the society will spend a lot of money on the problem, hire people to, quote, solve the problem. So on the right, people are going to say, hey, it's getting better, don't worry about it. We got other priorities out there, let's just take a pass on salmon now. So, but the key message is broader than that is don't get tricked by a 20 or 30 year data set and think that's the future. You do have these broad long-term trends that are downward, but over the short term, decades, you have actual increases. Well, this has not gone unnoticed. I mean, over the last 165 years or so, there's been a lot of efforts, very, very extensive efforts, hatcheries and others, very expensive efforts, and the cost of these fishways that are used to pass fish around dams can be very, very expensive. And of course, it remains contentious, and that is there are people who are arguing every permutation of a policy preference that you can think of. So basically, we've done a lot. It's still very contentious, but the bottom line is the long-term trend over multiple decades is still downward. Well, that was the past. What about the future? Well, let's look more carefully about the future. What will determine the future of wild salmon in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia? There's a lot of uncertainty, that's for sure, but some things are not uncertain. One of the things is, if society is really serious about restoring wild salmon, what must be done? And I'm not saying society should be serious about it, but if people say, what should we do, and get on with it, fine. As technical people, we can give you some accurate advice here. And what I would argue as a technical person is focus on the policy drivers, the thing that actually define the future of wild salmon. And let's look at those core policy drivers. And by core drivers, I mean the things that will actually define what's going to happen. And if you look at these drivers, if you don't change these long-term downward trends, you're going to end up with basically zero salmon within probably a century. If you're interested in this topic, you go to my faculty website at Oregon State, and there's more information on specifics. I just want to give a quick summary here of it. One example, and there are many others, so this is not the only example. The growth of the number of humans in the region. And when you talk about salmon, how often is this one of the core policy drivers? Not often, in my experience. People just take it as a given. There's nothing wrong with taking the human population in the region as a given. That's fine, perfectly fine, but there are some consequences which are virtually unavoidable. And my experience is that it's very rarely, except maybe in the abstract, ever talked about. But when you look at it, when somebody doesn't raise this issue, the person has explicitly accepted that the current growth trajectory is a given. Okay, let's do that as well. Let's take it as a given. The number of people on the West Coast, this policy driver says, if it's not changed, their aggregate demands to support their chosen lifestyles will continue to constrain the abundance of wild salmon. Now, that's not really very difficult. I mean, you're packing humans into the West Coast as you have in much of the earth. And so if you do that, there's something gives. And so it's not exactly complicated. It's pretty obvious. I think somebody off the street thinking about it for a few minutes will come up with the same idea. This is a core policy driver, the increasing human population in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. Let's look at this more carefully. Here's the world, 2021. And the areas, the darker the brown, or rust, or whatever that color is, the higher the density of people. And if you go to the Russian Far East, over there, East Asia, Japan, Korea, China, so forth, lots of people, and the salmon have largely disappeared in the areas that are brown or red. And the pattern there is where you have lots of people, lots of development, you have few salmon. The northern half of that distribution above Japan, Russian Far East, is pretty unpopulated, and wild salmon are doing quite well. If you go to Europe, as the population increased in continental Europe, including the UK, salmon disappeared. Now there's still residual runs, but for all practical purposes they're gone. But they still occur in northern Norway, some in Sweden, Finland, and around the Russian Federation. And so the same pattern. As the population increased in Europe, salmon decreased. In areas where there's not a lot of people, salmon are doing okay. If you go to eastern North America, same general pattern. As the population and development occurred in what is now the United States, salmon runs disappeared, and they're essentially gone. They do occur in reasonable numbers in the Maritimes of Canada, northern half of the distribution. Few people, lots of salmon. So let's look at our part of the world over here in western North America. This is what demographers call fill-in country, because it was largely empty. I mean, obviously there have been people there for a long time, but from a salmon perspective, it was largely empty, but it's gradually filling in the southern half of the distribution. So let's look at this area more carefully. It will fill in over the rest of this century, almost assuredly, and how much it will fill in is open for debate, but the general pattern is true. So let's look at the general pattern a bit more. Starting with California. Here we have California, and let's look at the growth of the area. Now, we do have bits and starts, depressions and pandemics, and the population of California is actually, right now, in the last year, has been fairly flat. But over the last 150, 160 years, it's been on a long-term growth trajectory. And over the long term in the future, my guess is it'll probably continue to grow. So let's look at it. It's roughly 40 million people now. And imagine 40 million people. These are approaching European population densities. And what about salmon habitat? As we see here on the left, that used to be, quote, pristine salmon habitat. Now it's pretty developed. Not ideal from a salmon perspective. Well, let's look out through the rest of this century to 2100. In 2100, the population of California, the projection is will not be its current 40 million people. It will be roughly 120 to 160 million people. That's 3 or 4 times more than what it has now. A lot of people. Now, what's that going to do for salmon habitat? Well, you can minimize the effect of salmon habitat, but if you triple or quadruple a human population, there's no way that's going to help salmon habitat. It'll be more and more constrained. Nothing wrong with that, or right for that matter, but that's just a fact of life. Now let's look for the Pacific Northwest, and by Pacific Northwest here, for what this exercise, I'm talking about Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Idaho, not Montana. So let's look at the population forecast in this region. Go back to 1850, the area is largely uninhabited. Now there clearly were people here, plenty of people here, and if you go back to 1500, there was probably many, many more people, maybe 1 million people in the region, maybe a lot more. But by 1850, there were very, very few people. 1900, the growth had gone to these 3 states, 1 province, to 1 million people. By 1950, it jumped up to maybe 4 million people. By 2000, turn of the millennium, it had jumped up to about 14 million people. So the projection, the question from a salmon perspective is, what's it likely to be in 2050 and 2100? Well, there's no way to say for sure, but I think one thing you can say, it will be a big number. The lowest possible rates I've seen any demographer ever say, and that is assuming the worst, well, from a human perspective, the worst possible developments, it's going to be maybe 20 or 30 million people. Projection could be, if you extrapolate out from the end of World War II, that's 60 years plus ago, the population will be over 100 million. But you can assume it's going to slow perhaps some. And so I think the target most people say we're working with is not 15 million people that you have now, but 65 million people by the end of this century. And the further into the century we go, the more this long-term trend seems to be holding. Well, given that population trajectory, and given that there's a little change in it, and there's little change in the other core policy drivers, which I've not covered, by 2100, we should have almost assuredly wild salmon reduced to remnant runs in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and southern British Columbia. No surprise here. I mean, if you quadruple a human population in the region, you're going to put tremendous pressure on the little remaining habitat. Nothing wrong with that, nothing right about that, just kind of a fact of life. Now, for those people who argue that we ought to reverse this downward trend, what kind of policies will they push? And so when you talk to people and say, well, okay, if you don't like that trajectory, which is fine, what do you recommend we do about it? Well, in general, their projections or their policy preferences will fit into one of 4 approaches. And there's a lot of difference in terms of specifics, but in general, they'll fit here, one of these. The first approach will be use technology. Get a grip on reality and use what tools you have. There are tools, hatcheries and so forth. And after all, what is this fixation on wild salmon? Salmon runs can be maintained by hatcheries, these people would argue. So why not focus on this? And after all, what is so sacred about wild salmon? We don't go out there and, get wild crops now. We use domesticated crops. Our beef don't roam the range. We raise them in captivity. So why don't we just do the same thing for salmon? Kind of a get real strategy. And for example, the tools these folks would recommend would be things like this. Use hatcheries. Get serious about hatcheries. You want big runs of fish that you can fish? You got to use hatcheries. Also, there's other ways that you can improve hatcheries to get them even more efficient, and that is go to spawning channels. Create habitat that's absolutely ideal spawning habitat that's very, quote, natural. Although it's built by bulldozers, it mimics wild situations. Also, you could improve existing habitat. Get real, get out there and get gravel of the appropriate size, control flow rates. You can improve habitat very well. And also, too, if you want wild salmon, if you're going to allow fishing, then there's a problem for wild salmon, and you just got to recognize that. No matter how you do it, if you allow fishing for hatchery-raised salmon, which most places do, there will be an adverse effect on wild salmon. These people might argue, though they probably wouldn't publicly argue it, they would probably say, well, that's cost of doing business, you got to do it. So anyway, these are the kind of tools this first group of people would say is essentially get real strategy, use the techniques. Going back to 1850 is not going to happen, accept it. A second approach is a little different twist. It's pretty much, okay, look, we're not going to go back to 1850, no argument there. So let's apply triage, and that is, let's just say, look, let's focus our efforts in areas that have the best chance of success. I mean, rather than waste a lot of money in their minds in restoring salmon runs to downtown Portland or downtown Seattle or downtown Sacramento, let's spend our money strategically, which means the areas that will have the greatest effect. And the triage tools that these folks will come up with tend to fit in one of several categories. Let's emphasize promising landscapes. These are areas that have the relatively less effective humans. These might be the coastal areas of Oregon, perhaps northern California, far northern California, perhaps the Washington coast, BC, British Columbia coast. These are areas where the habitat is pretty similar to what it was 150 years ago, and it's certainly a lot better than a lot of the developed areas around Seattle, Portland, and so on. And is right off, although it's not usually publicly stated, basically right off these areas like the Columbia, the Sacramento, San Joaquin, Puget Sound, these areas where your chance of bringing back wild salmon are just about zip. And so just be realistic. Now this doesn't tend to get a lot of PR, a lot of press. These people don't advertise it, but essentially triage means you focus on the promising and you basically don't spend your resources on the bleak. And you also, the tough sell here is the fact that areas like the downtown areas where the habitat is highly altered, you just got to tell people, look, there's other species, that fish species will do well here, but salmon aren't one of them. And sometimes that's a hard sell. But the challenge you have here with this one is the Endangered Species Act really doesn't easily allow this, because if a species is listed as at risk, either threatened or endangered, you've got to, quote, save it according to the Endangered Species Act. And so politically you can get sued, and any developer or anybody else doing this will get sued. And so even though this might intellectually make sense, politically, legally, it will be a challenge. So that's the second group of policy options that people talk about. The third approach is overhaul of bureaucracy, government bureaucracy particularly. There are really few bureaucratic incentives to protect or restore wild salmon runs, and so we do what political scientists call symbolic politics. That is, we spend a lot of money on it, we're very active, we hire lots of people, a lot of university professors get paid as consultants or researchers to work on these problems. There's a lot of money going around, there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of activity, but at the end of the day it's all symbolism, because it doesn't really make any difference in terms of the long-term salmon run. And the arguments these folks would use is you got to reform the bureaucracy. And the first thing you have to do is hold elected officials accountable. Elected officials will sell, given a choice, naturally, will sell win-win. My policy preferences allows everybody to be a winner. Well, there are no win-win in political science. Policy making is all about selecting winners and losers, and so every policy choice involves losers. Either people that hold salmon very important, wild salmon, or people hold fishing very important, or people hold developing housing very important, or improving roads. I mean, these are all competing policy preferences. So there's no win-win here. There's just compromise, which means is some people are losers. There's also an issue of government agency. No one ever gets fired for not restoring wild salmon. They might get fired for not having a plan in place to restore wild salmon, but if the plan doesn't do any good, it doesn't really matter because no government agency is ever held accountable. So somehow these folks would argue we got to hold government agencies accountable. And there's also the issue about you got to do something about lawsuits and Endangered Species Act, because right now salmon management is run essentially by lawyers and the Endangered Species Act, and so somehow that has to change, and then we have to hold the bureaucrats accountable. And of course then you've got another issue here, is that we have a massive industry, if you will, the salmon recovery industry, and that is people who are paid to work on the salmon recovery industry. There's literally billions of dollars spent on salmon recovery. So there's a lot of folks, consultants, hatchery people, university professors, government scientists. Lots of folks are fattening up on the salmon recovery budget. So just like the military-industrial complex, you've got this massive structure there that will argue vociferously that their activities should continue. The fourth approach. Now, these folks argue a number of different things, but their key message essentially is we've got to change somehow human behavior. We need to force behavioral change through incentives or punishments. And so force is not a word they would use, because usually they try to convince you if you just understand what we're trying to get done, you'd go along with it. But these folks would argue, look, in order to bring back salmon, is you got to give people a reason to change, make it worthwhile. Examples of this would be using various tools. For example, we might just close fishing altogether, period, close fishing. And if you close fishing, and after all, if you're really trying to bring back wild salmon, why would you allow fishing at all? Well, obviously there's going to be pushback here, because the people who like to fish are going to argue vociferously that that's lunacy. But if you're really serious, you ought to stop fishing. They would also argue that you got to change your lifestyle. People now demand tomatoes. They don't eat seasonally. We demand tomatoes year-round. We demand food year-round of different types. It used to be people would eat seasonally. Tomatoes only occurred one time a year, and you basically either ate them fresh or you canned them. Now we expect fresh tomatoes year-round. And of course, tomatoes in winter are either brought in from South America or they're grown in greenhouses, hothouses, and those are generally grown in hydro-generated electricity, which is not good for salmon. There's nothing wrong with having tomatoes in winter, but there is a cost for salmon. So these people would argue we got to change that in people's life. Now, I would expect if you go to eliminate seasonal fruits in winter or non-seasonal fruits in winter, you're going to get a lot of pushback politically. But these are the kind of behavioral tools that need to be enforced, according to these people, if you're going to bring back wild salmon. Also, you got to learn to tolerate flooding. Now, a lot of the issues with salmon and dams are because of floods, and so we have some really bad historic floods from a human perspective. But floods are good for salmon. I mean, almost always floods are very good. So you've got competition here. Most humans don't like floods at all, and from a salmon perspective, floods are a good thing. Keep the runs going. And you also have this thing I've already mentioned, this population trajectory. I mean, if you're going to allow the population to quadruple in the Pacific Northwest, in California for that matter, your options are pretty limited. Now, that's not to say that you ought to do anything about the population trajectory, but if you're not going to, that means you've already decided you're going to let it play out the way it's going to play out. And there will be additional consequences for salmon. Okay, there are options, no question, that would restore wild salmon, but, and this is the big but, this is not an issue with no alternatives. There are plenty of choices, but the real issue here is that should one of these be adopted? That's not for scientists, that's not for policy experts and others, people like me, to decide. That's ultimately an individual society choice. It's not for scientists to say we ought to do this. It's up to the people to do this, because they're the one who are going to bear the cost. The choices are all about trade-offs. It's not an issue with no choices. There are plenty of choices. There are plenty of choices that would work, but there are some big trade-offs. Society decides, not technocrats. So if you're looking for the, quote, government, the bureaucrats to decide, not going to happen. They will only enforce what the public at large supports. And equally important, science. Scientific information is only one factor, but only one. In fact, this is an area where science probably has a very, very low level of importance in terms of decision making. The choices here are relatively clear. They're unpleasant, but they're relatively clear. Science can help inform and describe those options, those choices, but it can't decide between them. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today.